The mountain wore its silence like a uniform, pressed and severe. Cold seeped from the ground, a damp chill that worked its way through the thick soles of Rowan's boots and settled in his bones. It was a familiar cold, the kind that spoke of iron-rich earth and long, lightless winters. Pine resin and wet decay formed the day's liturgy, a scent that clung to the air in the hollows and clung to his memory in ways he refused to examine. Above, the November sky was the color of a tarnished knife, a flat, bruised gray that filtered the light and stole the color from the world. Rowan moved through the skeletal woods with a practiced economy, his steps measured and quiet on the carpet of damp leaves and pine needles. He was here to inspect the North Perimeter Trail, a simple task, but he moved like a man expecting ambush. His eyes, the color of that same sky, scanned not the path ahead but the spaces between the trees, the unnatural shadows, the places where the pattern of the world was broken. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of compact strength that came not from gyms, but from years of carrying heavy things over difficult terrain. His olive field jacket was worn soft at the elbows, a history written in faded fabric. The face was hard angles and rough beard, softened only by the fine silver beginning to thread through his temples. Beside him, moving with a fluid grace that made the man seem clumsy by comparison, was Sargent. The dog was a German shepherd, black and tan, with a coat that drank the weak light. He was not a pet. He was a partner. His movements were tactical, his position always a half step ahead and to Rowan's left, clearing the path with his senses. His dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing. They took in the world with the focused stare of a professional taking inventory, a gaze that landed with the weight of a hand on the shoulder. Their communication was a silent language of posture and breath. A slight tension in Rowan's jaw was a command to hold. A subtle shift in the dog's weight was a signal of something unseen. They had been walking for an hour, the rhythm of their progress a steady, lulling beat against the quiet. The trail here was narrow, a muddy track winding through thickets of rhododendron and hemlock. Rowan noted a fallen birch, its bark peeling like old parchment, likely from the last storm. He noted the scrape marks of a deer on a young maple. Routine. Normal. Then the routine broke. Sargent stopped. It wasn't a sudden halt, but a slow freezing of motion, as if the cold ground had finally claimed him. He stood utterly still, head low, ears canted forward. Not a growl, not a bark, just a deep internal stillness that radiated from him like a drop in temperature. His tail, usually held in a relaxed curve, was now rigid and low. He took a short, sharp breath through his nose, and then another. He refused to continue down the trail. Rowan stopped beside him, placing a hand on the dog's neck. The muscle beneath the thick fur was wire-tight. He followed the dog's fixed gaze. It wasn't directed down the path, but to the right, into a dense, uninviting wall of forest where no trail existed. A place where the shadows were deeper, older. Rowan scanned the tree line, his own senses straining. He saw nothing, heard nothing but the whisper of the wind through the pines. But he had learned long ago, in places far deadlier than this, that the dog saw things he could not. The dog felt the dissonant note in the symphony of the woods. Rowan gave the dog's neck a slow, firm rub. He didn't need to speak. The dog knew he had been heard. "All right, Sarge," Rowan murmured, his voice a low rumble absorbed by the damp air. "Show me." Sargent moved, not with the easy gait of a patrol, but with the low, deliberate crawl of a stalker. He pushed through a curtain of tangled briars, thorns snagging on his coat without him flinching. Rowan followed, the branches whipping at his face, the ground sucking at his boots. The air grew colder, heavier. The smell of pine and earth was slowly being replaced by something else, a scent that didn't belong here. The metallic, faintly sweet odor of rust and old fuel. It was a smell from a different life, a scent of closed spaces and catastrophic failure. They pushed through one last wall of rhododendron, the waxy leaves cold and wet against his hands, and then the world opened into a small, shadowed clearing. And there it was, what should not have been here. The wreck lay before them like a fallen god, half swallowed by the forest floor. It was a small plane, a Cessna, its fuselage crumpled and torn, one wing sheared off and lying 20 feet away like a discarded bone. Moss grew in thick, velvety patches over its aluminum skin, and a young birch tree grew straight through the fractured cockpit window. Rust spread across the exposed metal like a wound that refused to scab. The wreck watched them the way old debts watch from across a room. Rowan stood at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting on Sargent's head, a silent anchor in a suddenly unstable world. Official records said this area was clean. A different crash, a larger one, had happened miles south of here decades ago, and the cleanup had been thorough. This was something else. This was a secret the mountain had kept. Sargent whined, a low, guttural sound of distress he rarely made. He stayed close to Rowan's leg, his body pressed against him, a solid line of warmth against the encroaching cold. Rowan's training took over, a cold cascade of procedure that pushed back the initial shock. He scanned the perimeter. No tracks, at least none that were fresh. The decay was deep, profound. This had been here a very long time. He moved forward slowly, Sargent at his heel. The dog was leading now, his nose twitching, taking in the library of scents. He paused near the ripped-open cargo door, his head tilting. Rowan knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of the torn metal. It was a jagged, violent tear, but near the latch, the metal was bent in a way that suggested it had been forced from the inside. He peered into the dark, cramped interior. The smell of mildew and stagnant water was overwhelming. Sargent, however, seemed agitated by a different smell. He sneezed twice, a sharp, percussive sound in the silence. A chemical. Rowan's eyes followed the dog's gaze to a stack of something in the corner, covered by a sheet of rotted, plastic-impregnated canvas. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cold, slimy material, and pulled it back. It wasn't cargo. It was supplies. Canned goods, their labels long since dissolved into pulp, were stacked in a neat pyramid. Sealed plastic containers held what might have been medical supplies. A small, military-issue water purifier lay beside them. The straps on the passenger seats hadn't snapped in the crash. They had been cut cleanly with a knife. Someone survived this. The thought landed not with relief, but with a cold, heavy dread. Someone survived, and they stayed here. They were organized. They planned. They waited. It was the faint, lingering scent of old fuel that did it. That particular smell, kerosene mixed with oil and the sharp tang of hot metal, was a key to a door in his mind he kept triple-bolted. For a split second, he wasn't in a cold forest in Pennsylvania. He was in the belly of a C-130, the air thick with the roar of engines and the smell of sweat and ozone. The red light was on. The ramp was about to drop. The space was tight, claustrophobic. Men yelling, the floor vibrating with a terrible grinding shudder. The smell of smoke, the scream of tearing metal. His breath hitched. The forest blurred at the edges. The cold in his bones became the freezing shock of seawater. He put a hand out, bracing himself against the fuselage of the wrecked Cessna, the rough, oxidized aluminum biting into his palm. The physical sensation was an anchor. He focused on it. Cold, rough, real. A wet nose pressed insistently into his braced hand. Then a heavy head rested on his knee. Sargent looked up at him, his dark eyes steady, unwavering. There was no judgment in the dog's gaze, just a quiet, grounding presence. I am here. You are here. Now. Rowan took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of pine and wet earth flooding back in, chasing away the ghosts of salt and smoke. He scrubbed a hand over his face, the rasp of his beard a familiar, living texture. Yeah, he breathed, his voice hoarse. I'm here. Sargent seemed satisfied. He pulled away from Rowan and moved with renewed purpose back toward the cockpit. He sniffed around the pilot's seat, which was twisted at a sickening angle, then began to paw insistently at a spot under the seat, a low whine rumbling in his chest. A small, rusted metal lockbox was wedged deep in the wreckage, pinned by a bent piece of the frame. It was almost invisible, covered in decades of dirt and debris. Rowan knelt, the damp earth soaking through the knee of his cargo pants. He pulled his pocket knife, the familiar weight of it settling in his hand, and used the tip to pry at the crushed metal around the box. The steel groaned in protest. Rust flaked away, falling like dried blood onto his gloves. Finally, with a sharp crack, the The piece gave way. He pulled the box free. It was heavy for its size. The latch was rusted shut, but the hinges gave way when he forced them with the blade. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of what had once been cotton batting, now a yellowed, moldy mess, were a few items, miraculously preserved. A compass, its needle frozen, pointing to a forgotten north. A slim journal, its leather cover warped and stained, the pages swollen and fused together by moisture. And lying on top of the journal, a single tarnished silver rectangle on a broken ball chain. A dog tag. Time seemed to stop. The wind died. The forest held its breath. Rowan reached in with 2 fingers and lifted the tag. It was cold, unnaturally cold, against his skin. He didn't need to wipe away the grime. He didn't need to hold it up to the weak light. The name was already seared into his brain, rising up from the deep well of his past. The name he had carried like a stone in his gut for 20 years. Miller, D. The world tilted, and the silence of the mountain rushed in to fill the void. He had a second tag in a box back at his cabin, the one they had issued him for the memorial service. This one was real. The name on the tag was a ghost made solid. Lieutenant David Miller. The first officer Rowan had ever truly looked up to, the man who had shaped him from a reckless kid into a disciplined operator. Miller had taught him how to read a river, how to find true north by the stars, how to tell the difference between the sound of wind in the pines and the sound of a man trying to be wind in the pines. He was quiet, competent, and possessed a fundamental decency that was rare in their line of work. The official story was a clean, tragic lie. A training exercise over the Atlantic, a sudden squall. The plane went down in a deep-sea trench, taking Miller and the pilot with it. The search was vast, expensive, and ultimately fruitless. Rowan had been on one of the search boats, a green kid barely out of training, scanning the endless gray waves for days, his gut churning with a mixture of seasickness and a desperate, useless hope. Then the order came to stand down. Mission over. Body unrecoverable. They held a service, gave his widow a folded flag, and issued commemorative dog tags to the men in his unit. A neat, tidy end to a messy reality. But this wreck wasn't in the Atlantic. This tag wasn't a commemorative copy. This was the truth, rusted and half-buried, lying in the Pennsylvania dirt for 2 decades. The tidy story unraveled in an instant, leaving behind a tangle of questions that felt like razor wire in his chest. The guilt he had carried, the feeling that they had given up too soon, that he had failed to find his mentor, surfaced with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was anger. A cold, burning rage at the lie he had been fed, the lie he had accepted. He sat back on his heels, the cold from the ground a distant fact. He needed help. But calling this in through official channels felt like a betrayal. They had lied once. They would lie again. He needed someone who operated outside the system. Someone who understood the weight of things left unsaid. There was only one person. He pulled out his satellite phone, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He dialed the number from memory. It rang twice. Thorns? The voice was low, calm, laced with the faint smell of motor oil and sawdust. Elias, it's Rowan. There was a pause, but not an empty one. It was a pause filled with listening. You sound 1,000 miles away. You all right? I found something. Rowan's voice was tight, strained. North perimeter, off the trail. I need you. Another pause, shorter this time. An hour, Elias said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a fact. The line went dead. Elias Thorne arrived in 54 minutes. His old blue Ford pickup, dented and faded but meticulously maintained, navigated the rough service road with a steady confidence. He was a man built like a blacksmith, with thick arms and a quiet demeanor. Like Rowan, he was a veteran who had come to these mountains seeking silence, but for different reasons. He was a mechanic, a man who understood the logic of engines and the illogic of men. He stepped out of the truck carrying a large, dented steel thermos. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just handed Rowan a cup of steaming black coffee. You find something you weren't supposed to, Elias stated, his eyes taking in Rowan's pale face, the tension in his shoulders. He looked past him, toward the wall of trees. Rowan just nodded, leading the way back into the clearing. Elias followed without a word. his presence a solid, calming counterweight to the frantic energy buzzing under Rowan's skin. He looked at the wreck, his gaze slow and methodical, taking in the details Rowan had seen, the cut straps, the supplies. He whistled softly. Someone walked away from this. Miller, Rowan said, his voice flat. He held out the dog tag. Elias took it, his calloused fingers gentle. He wiped it clean on his jeans and read the name. His expression didn't change, but a stillness settled over him. He knew the story. He'd heard it from Rowan late one night, years ago, over a bottle of whiskey. He looked from the tag to the wreck, then back to Rowan's face. His gaze held, just a beat longer than necessary. In that look, Rowan saw not pity, but recognition. Recognition of the weight, of the ghost that had just been given a name and a place. A knot of grief and rage in Rowan's chest loosened a fraction of an inch, a strange, unnamed ache of relief. As they stood in the heavy silence, Sargent, who had been sitting patiently, got up and moved back to the wreck. He didn't circle it. He didn't sniff for scents. He walked directly to the mangled cockpit, to the pilot's side, and lay down. He placed his head on his paws, his body aligned with the fuselage, his gaze fixed on the space where the door had been torn away. It wasn't the alert posture of a guard dog. It was a vigil. It was the posture of waiting for someone to come home. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced the fog of Rowan's own past. Miller, standing by the kennels, a lanky German shepherd pup tripping over his own feet to get to him. "This one's Sargent," Miller had said, grinning. "He's got the right kind of serious." The pup had been assigned to Miller just a month before the accident. He hadn't been on the flight. He'd been reassigned. He'd eventually ended up with Rowan. Rowan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a dog's training kicking in. This was memory. The dog remembered his first handler. He was keeping watch. The discovery wasn't just Rowan's anymore. It was theirs. The dog's quiet, steadfast grief was a mirror to his own, a living testament to the man they had both lost. With Elias's quiet resolve bolstering his own, Rowan made the call. He didn't call the state police or the feds. He called Sarah Jenkins, the head ranger for this section of the National Forest. She was a woman in her early 40s, practical and sharp, with a deep respect for the land and little patience for bureaucracy. She met them at the trailhead, her expression grim as Rowan laid out the facts, presenting the dog tag as evidence. "The official record for this grid is clear," she said, frowning. "No reported wrecks. I'll have to file this as a new potential fatality." She looked at Rowan, her eyes assessing. "You're sure about the name?" "I'm sure," Rowan said. She nodded. "All right, I'll make the call. But don't expect a parade. Things like this, old things, they make people nervous." Her words proved prophetic. The response, when it came the next morning, was not a forensics team or state investigators. It was a sleek, black SUV with tinted windows that looked alien against the rustic backdrop of the ranger station. Two people got out. A man and a woman, both dressed in expensive, tailored suits that were utterly impractical for the terrain. They moved with a smooth, unhurried confidence. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Davies of Aegis Solutions, did all the talking. He had a warm smile that didn't touch his eyes, and a voice like honey laced with tranquilizer. "Sarah Jenkins? Rowan?" he said as if they were old friends. "Thank you for your diligence. We appreciate citizens taking an active role in environmental stewardship." "We're an aviation recovery and archival firm," the woman added, her voice crisp and professional. "We're contracted to manage sensitive sites like this one." "This isn't a sensitive site," Sarah countered, her arms crossed. "This is an undocumented crash with a potential human casualty." Davies' smile didn't falter. "Ah, that's a common misconception. This is the old Hemlock Creek crash, 1978. It's in our archives. Scheduled for a full environmental remediation next spring. Your man here just stumbled on it a bit early. Saves us some survey work, so again, thank you." His language was a soft, suffocating blanket, designed to smother questions before they could be asked. Rowan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "The tag," he said, his voice low and hard. "It's from a Navy officer, Lieutenant David Miller. He went down in the Atlantic 20 years ago." Davies turned his placid gaze on Rowan. For the first time, Rowan saw a flicker of something cold in his eyes. "Mr. Rowan, is it? We're aware of your background. Special operations, correct? Highly stressful work. Memories can become scrambled after traumatic experiences. It's very common. We'd be happy to take custody of the artifact for proper archival and return it to the Navy, to ensure it's handled with the respect it deserves." The offer was an insult wrapped in a compliment. He wasn't offering help. He was offering to make the problem disappear. Beside Rowan's leg, Sargent, who had been sitting in a perfect, still posture, emitted a low, vibrating rumble from deep in his chest. It was a sound Rowan had felt more than heard, a warning that was pure, controlled menace. The dog's eyes were locked on Davies, his body a coiled spring. Davies' gaze flickered to the dog, and his smile thinned at the edges. A fine animal, well-trained. He turned his attention back to Rowan, his tone shifting, the velvet glove slipping just enough to reveal the iron fist. Of course, disturbing a crash site, especially one with military connections, can be a legal minefield. Jurisdictional tangles, national security statutes, it gets very complicated. It's always best to let the designated professionals handle it. He mentioned Rowan's discharge, the one for accumulated operational stress, letting the phrase hang in the air, a veiled threat against his credibility. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a bureaucratic mix-up. This was a cover-up, and Aegis Solutions was the cleanup crew. They were here to bury Miller for a second time. "This is federal land, Mr. Davies," Sarah said, her voice like flint. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Davies and Rowan. "My office is the primary authority here until I'm told otherwise by the Department of the Interior. And this site is now an active investigation. Your company will remain outside the perimeter until we are finished." Her professionalism was a shield, solid and unyielding. Standing just behind Rowan, Elias hadn't said a word. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his presence a silent declaration. He was a mountain that would not be moved. Davies looked from Sarah's determined face to Elias's quiet immovability, to Rowan's cold fury, and finally to the dog's unwavering stare. For a moment, the mask of polite professionalism slipped entirely, revealing a flash of raw annoyance. Then it was back. "Of course, Ranger Jenkins," he said smoothly. "We're here to cooperate. We'll wait for your official directive." He gave a small, tight nod and returned to his SUV, the woman following in his wake. They didn't leave. They just parked, waiting. A pair of well-dressed vultures. The system, as it turned out, was designed to protect itself. The next morning, Sarah received a call from a regional supervisor she'd never spoken to before. He informed her, in polite but firm terms, that Aegis Solutions had been granted full jurisdictional authority by a federal directive she wasn't cleared to see. The site was now their responsibility. Her investigation was terminated. When she protested, she was calmly advised that pushing the issue would be detrimental to her career. When Rowan and Sargent returned to the clearing, it was gone. Not the wreck itself, but the story it told. The site was cordoned off with bright yellow tape bearing the Aegis logo. The supplies were gone. The cut straps had been removed. The interior of the plane had been scrubbed and stripped, leaving nothing but bare, clean metal. It now looked exactly like what Davies claimed it was, an old, empty shell. The metal box, the journal, and Miller's dog tag, which Rowan had reluctantly turned over to Sarah as official evidence, were now in Aegis's possession, transferred to a secure archival facility. They had vanished into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed Miller 20 years ago. The local paper ran a small article a few days later. A retired veteran, suffering from PTSD, had mistaken an old, documented crash site for a military conspiracy. The narrative was neat, plausible, and utterly devastating. Rowan was discredited, isolated. The truth had been erased. He retreated. The failure was a physical weight, pressing down on him, forcing the air from his lungs. He had found Miller only to lose him again. The guilt was a bitter poison. He had let it happen. He had trusted a system that was built on lies. He locked himself in his cabin, the silence amplifying the accusations in his own head. He didn't answer Sarah's calls. He saw the thermos Elias left on his porch railing and left it there to grow cold. He pushed away the people who had tried to help, retreating into the familiar, painful solitude he had mistaken for peace. The past wasn't a memory anymore. It was the only room he could live in. The walls were made of his failures, the teammate he hadn't pulled from the fire fast enough, the intel he had misread, the search for Miller he had abandoned. He was back in the cold water, scanning an empty horizon for a man who was already buried in the dirt 1,000 miles away. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the promises he had failed to keep. Through it all, Sargent stayed. Rowan barely registered him. He forgot to fill his food bowl. He didn't speak to him, didn't touch him. He moved around the dog as if he were just another piece of furniture. But Sargent was not furniture. He was a presence, patient and unshakable. He did not whine for food or paw for attention. He simply endured his master's retreat. He lay by the cold fireplace, his head on his paws, watching Rowan with those steady, intelligent eyes. When Rowan paced the small cabin, the dog paced with him, a silent, furry shadow. When Rowan slumped in a chair and stared at nothing, the dog rested his heavy head on his knee, a solid, living weight against the crushing emptiness. One evening, as Rowan sat staring into the dying embers of a fire he didn't remember building, lost in a gray fog of self-recrimination, Sargent stood up. He walked to the hook by the door, took his own worn leather leash gently in his mouth, and carried it back to Rowan. He didn't drop it with a clatter or nudge it forward. He laid it carefully on the floor at Rowan's feet. Then he sat, looking at the leash, then back at Rowan. The message was as clear as a spoken word. This is not over. Our work is not done. Get up. Rowan stared at the leash, the worn leather, the scuffed metal clip. It was a simple object, but in the profound silence of his despair, it felt like a sacrament. The dog's unwavering loyalty, his refusal to let him disappear completely into his own grief, was a tether to the world he was trying to leave behind. It was a loyalty Miller had inspired, a legacy the dog carried in his very bones. Rowan looked from the leash to the dog's expectant face. For the first time in days, he saw him, truly saw him. Slowly, as if moving a limb that had been asleep for years, Rowan leaned down and picked up the leash. He clipped the leash to Sargent's collar, the click of the metal latch a small, decisive sound in the quiet cabin. They drove back to the perimeter in silence, the truck's headlights cutting a tunnel through the pre-dawn gloom. The Aegis tape was still there, a flimsy, arrogant barrier. Rowan cut it without hesitation. He let Sargent off the leash. "Find him, boy," he said, his voice rough. Sargent didn't go to the plane. He ignored the sterilized, soulless wreck completely. He cast about the clearing for a moment, his nose to the ground, and then he moved with sharp, sudden purpose. He led Rowan away from the clearing, 50 yards into a stand of old-growth pines, their massive trunks like the pillars of a forgotten temple. At the base of the largest tree, a giant whose roots buckled the earth, Sargent stopped. He whined once, a high, keen sound, and began to dig, his paws tearing at the soil and roots with a frantic, focused energy. Rowan dropped to his knees beside him, his bare hands clawing at the cold, damp earth. He felt it before he saw it, the hard, unyielding corner of something man-made. Together, man and dog unearthed a mud-caked, military-green ammo can. It was heavy. The seals were still intact. Rowan used his knife to break them. Inside, wrapped in thick, oil-stained cloth, was another journal and a small, handheld cassette recorder. Miller had known. He had survived the crash, injured but alive. He must have known they wouldn't search here. He must have known someone would eventually find the plane. He hadn't put his faith in a rescue. He had put his faith in a discovery. He had made a dead drop. Back in the truck, the dome light casting a sickly yellow glow, Rowan pressed play. The tape hissed for a moment, and then a voice filled the small space. A voice Rowan hadn't heard in 20 years, but one he knew as well as his own. It was Miller. He sounded weak, his breathing labored, but his words were clear, precise. He wasn't in a training accident. He was a whistleblower. He had been transporting evidence, financial records, shipping manifests, that proved a high-ranking general was selling military-grade weapons to a South American cartel. He was flying to a secret meeting with the Justice Department contact when his plane's engine seized. Sabotage. He knew he was dying. His injuries from the crash were too severe to hike out. The logbook contained everything. The tape was his testimony. "If you're hearing this," Miller's voice crackled, "it means they didn't find me. It means you have a choice. Let it lie or see it through. The truth doesn't die if someone is willing to carry it." Rowan's hands were shaking. He called Sarah first, then Elias. He didn't explain over the phone. Elias's garage, 1 hour. They met under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage, the air thick with the smell of grease and steel. Elias, with the gentle precision of a surgeon, coaxed the old cassette player back to life. Sarah stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim concentration. They listened to Miller's final words in stunned silence. When it was over, no one spoke for a long time. "They didn't just cover up his death," Sarah finally said, her voice tight with fury. "They buried a federal crime." "And the general he mentioned," Elias added quietly, wiping his hands on a rag, "is now a senator, sits on the Armed Services Committee." They didn't go to the FBI. They didn't go to the state police. The system was compromised. Sarah made a call. A single call to a journalist she had known for years, a woman with a reputation for being a bulldog, someone who operated outside the established networks. They met her in a dingy diner 2 towns over. Rowan laid out the logbook. They played her the tape. She listened, her expression unreadable, and when it was done, she simply said, "Let me make some copies." The story didn't break. It detonated. It bypassed the local news and landed on the front page of a national paper. A meticulously documented exposé of corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Aegis Solutions was revealed as a corporate cutout, a private entity used by powerful men to sanitize their crimes, run by former intelligence officers loyal to the old network. Miller's voice, from a 20-year-old grave, was the testimony that brought the whole rotten structure down. It wasn't violence or revenge that won. It was a dead man's foresight, a dog's memory, and the integrity of a few people who refused to look away. Days later, the initial storm had passed, leaving a churn of investigations and resignations in its wake. Rowan sat on his porch, the evening air crisp and cold. He watched the last light bleed from the sky, turning the mountains into dark, sleeping shapes. He heard the familiar rumble of Elias's truck long before he saw the headlights. Elias parked but didn't kill the engine. He walked up the porch steps, 2 long-neck bottles of beer in one hand. He twisted the cap off one and handed it to Rowan. He sat in the worn wicker chair beside him, the chair that was always empty. They sat in a comfortable silence that few people could share, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. After a long time, Elias spoke, his voice quiet. "He'd be proud of you, Rowan." He reached over and put a firm hand on Rowan's shoulder. The touch was brief, grounding. It wasn't pity or congratulations. It was acknowledgement. "You stayed." The words, simple and true, landed in Rowan's chest with the weight of a blessing. He had spent half his life running, and for the first time, he had stood his ground. He hadn't brought Miller back, but he had brought his truth home. The quiet pressure of Elias's hand, the shared silence, the simple act of showing up, it was an exhalation, a release of a tension he had carried for 2 decades. A quiet, fragile peace settled over him. The aftermath was messy, incomplete. The senator resigned, citing health reasons, but never faced a trial. The full extent of the arms network remained shrouded in classified documents. The world was not transformed. But Aegis Solutions was dismantled. The official record was corrected. Lieutenant David Miller was no longer a casualty of an accident, but a hero who had died in service to the truth. A new headstone was placed in Arlington, a place for his family to finally grieve. Change was not a tidal wave. It was a single stone dropped in a still pond, its ripples spreading outward, slow and sure. Rowan was offered medals, official apologies from the Navy, interviews. He turned them all down. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it to quiet a ghost, to finish a job. He looked out from his porch at the mountains that had held the secret, at the small town nestled in the valley. He had come here seeking solitude, a place to hide from the world, but he had found a community, however small. It is the belief in the loyalty of a good dog, in the courage of a dead man's words, in the quiet integrity of a friend who shows up without being asked. It is the understanding that some seeds are planted in darkness, not to be hidden, but to be protected, waiting for the right season and the right soul to come along and tend to them, allowing what was buried to finally break through into the light.